Are you on?
I don't think I turned this on yet. So I'll probably turn it on. There we go.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much, Ron.
I got an introduction to Chris from a colleague here at the center, and Chris was kind enough to come, and we had arranged his visit to the class about a year ago. And we had absolutely no idea that it was going to be quite this timely. So,
See, we orchestrated this all.
and so a few weeks ago, I asked if he would be willing to do this presentation to just address what's been going on lately with Facebook and privacy in general. So I know once we get started about talking about privacy and Facebook, we will not deviate from that topic. And I just thought it might be nice to, especially since you're an alumni here, could you just briefly talk about how you ended up from graduating to be a GC at Facebook, and when you left, why, and what have you done since?
Sure. I clerked for a year after I graduated in '97 and had been very active on the Journal of Law and Technology here, and was sort of planning to go back to Silicon Valley and practice. And I finally signed the paperwork to go to Wilson-Sonsini after I clerked. Was in.
I interned there.
Oh, excellent.
Yeah.
Was down in the Southern District Court with Barry Moskowitz, who later became the chief judge and still a good friend to this day in San Diego, and then joined Wilson in '98. Got involved with a number of major cases. Had joined primarily to be on the antitrust team representing Netscape and a number of other Silicon Valley companies in the Microsoft antitrust trial, and that was part of my practice. But another part developed when and that had fateful implications for my ending up at Facebook. We had represented a company called Diamond Multimedia, which manufactured the first MP3 player, and the recording industry sued us to try to stop the shipment of the MP3 player, claiming that it was a digital audio recording device under the Audio Home Recording Act, and that we didn't have serial copy management system, all sorts of defined terms in these laws, and we fought that and won eventually on appeal, which we expected to lose at the district court. We won on appeal. But through this and through all that activity in the music industry, I got to know this guy named Sean Parker, who was founding this company called Napster. And after bouncing around in a couple of different companies, going out from Wilson to a company that we sold to Excited Home, blowing up in a spectacular piece of the internet bust, heading back into law firm practice at Baker McKenzie for a while. I had come out to become general counsel of a company called Spoke, which was an early competitor of LinkedIn's. And Sean and I were back in touch in the summer of 2005, and he said, "Hey, you've got to come over and meet my new friend Mark Zuckerberg. We've been over at Facebook working away. You should come over." And I came over, and 6 weeks later I was general counsel. So that was September of '05. And then I left largely to do the AG race in 2010. From working with AGs nationally and working with law enforcement internationally and policymakers internationally. I worked in politics before I went to law school. I dropped out of grad school to go to work for Bill Clinton in the '92 campaign. I worked for the White House Domestic Policy Council and at the Department of Education. So politics was always sort of interesting to me, and so it was a chance to step out and hopefully kind of bring a different perspective to things. And I didn't win the primary, so then I started investing and doing a whole bunch of different things, and sort of focused a lot on how technology is transforming media and entertainment, and that continues to be a fascination and the basis for a number of my companies. I stopped doing direct film production. I produced a movie called Jiro Dreams of Sushi, which was a pretty fantastic hit, and certainly had a lot of fascinating cultural impact about perfectionism and family dynamics and a bunch of different things. And David Gelb, who was the director of that, has become quite a star and done Chef's Table on Netflix and a number of different things. And have focused on distribution and how changing distribution works these days. So that's what a lot of my time is spent on, and the sports fits into that media and entertainment world pretty nicely.
I think we'll get into some of the distribution questions later when we start getting into Facebook. I want to mention one thing that I had asked you earlier, which was whether or not you're changing roles, whether you're activist, whether you're running as a Democrat for office versus general counsel representing the interests of monetization potential at a company. Did that change your perspective on the use of data? And I was somewhat surprised by your answer, but not completely.
It really didn't. And I think ultimately, I don't think that there's somehow inherently anything wrong with thinking about how you effectively offer free services online and make a business work around that. It has to be done in an open fashion, and in my AG race, I ended up in a public dispute with the company about some decisions that they had made after I left, and that was sort of an unfortunate circumstance in a number of different ways, but it was necessary, and I think that we both sort of had our say there, and the company ended up actually rolling back most of the changes and accepting an FTC consent decree around it, and moving on.
Okay. Let's talk about how are some of the ways that Facebook makes money. I think we talked about the injection of paid content into a stream, or just the way advertising in general works.
Well, I mean, media businesses have always been attention brokerage businesses. That they're always about how do you take things that people want to watch and attach things that they might not want to watch to them. Television is that way. Internet feeds are that way. What's changed is how interconnected the world is, and Facebook has become a sort of de facto identity layer. And then also a false identity layer for some players in a way that the company is now sort of much more actively policing and working to change, which is a good thing. And it was another sort of foundational principle that we tried to reflect and protect over time while I was there, was the idea that this was your real identity that you were representing online. Now, when you get that personal, you can actually learn a lot about someone, and ideally, in a world where you're presenting them a product for free, that you're going to give them the most relevant advertisements that you can. Google operates on that principle. You don't pay for a Google search. Facebook operates on that principle. You don't pay to have a Facebook account. All sorts of other businesses on Yahoo worked largely the same way in terms of basic access. I think that there's some interesting discussions to be had about business models over time for how you and I'm particularly fascinated with subscription-based businesses right now because you're establishing a longer relationship, and it's a deeper trust relationship where a lot of cable companies and a number of different players have traditionally talked about kind of owning that customer relationship. Cable companies, of course, are not terribly loved by consumers in any meaningful way. But the shift to streaming that's happening there is another piece of what I think we've seen in an online environment, where it's the insertion of these things that you might not necessarily want to see in order to subsidize the things that you want to see, including sports. And so it's interesting to be in that business too.
So let me just take a step back. We had recently Tim Cook made a comment that said he was basically faulting the monetization or business model of Facebook, saying that they don't capitalize on their user data that way. I know that they're selling product, and there's just very different business models involved there. Do you think that is Apple using their customer data in certain ways? Is this about selling to third parties?
Well, they're certainly using their customer list over time to say when the next iPhone comes out, and where they can make a large margin on selling you the next iPhone. And they're certainly sort of using advertising extensively to promote demand for their various products, including their subscription products, which collect an enormous amount of data about what you're listening to. And I think it would almost be irresponsible for them not to use that data on your behalf to give you more music that you'd be interested in. And so in many ways, I thought his comments were kind of strange and not necessarily totally thought out.
So let's take it one step back. I don't currently have a Facebook account. I never had one. And if I came to you and asked whether or not I might want one, is net positive or not, could you tell me something about the reasons I might want to or might not want to?
Well, the number one thing that I have always said to everyone from the beginning, and I joined the company when it was still college only, although I used my post.harvard email address to get on, which was encouraged at that point and not terribly focused on. That was my first experience, was when we didn't have a news feed. All we had were profiles, and people would surf around, and photos was a new feature that was going to be introduced, and all of these different things. But ultimately, what it's become for me is a way to keep in touch with friends and family sort of around the globe. And I know I have public subscribers who don't necessarily get all of my content that I choose to put up in my feed. But that's fine too. I mean, I think that to some extent it has become a kind of life-casting medium for a number of people. And that's something that you can use it for, but you can also use it for in a very locked down way for just friends and family if you so choose. But that bi-directional friending principle is one that the company has luckily kept, and I think that that's a really solid path forward for them over time. And so as a new user, if you're uncomfortable with the idea of an account, you start out really slowly. I'll be your friend. And
that might be enough reason right there.
Right,
okay.
to stay away. Right?
I am on LinkedIn, for example. And in that case, I think all of the data that I have there leak away because I want everybody. That's my resume, et cetera, and it's exactly that purpose. Yeah. The stuff that I think people are putting on Facebook, they want to have a sense of control over. And when I think about maybe Apple's use of user data as being kept within Apple, part of the issue that's come up with the Facebook data issues now has been some notion of lack of control or a leak to third parties. And I'm curious, this isn't Facebook's desire, apparently.
Right, and this is where, I mean, apps are a fascinating, evolution of the way that platforms have worked. The mobile platforms, Android and iOS, and there used to be a whole bunch of other mobile platforms, but there really aren't anymore. But apps were meant to provide an extension of functionality to those platforms. Those platforms, Apple does share data with the app providers. I mean, some data, and that there's permissioning that is given to do that when you sign on to iOS now. It's much less extensive than it is, for example, on Android. Android shares much more recently, and there have been some stories about Facebook having captured Android data, which actually is sort of data that's just shared by the Android platform. And Facebook, I think, is looking at all of its data policies right now as to whether or not it's taking data that it can actually use on people's behalf or for ad targeting. And I should say, importantly, that the way that a lot of the discussion of advertising gets cast is that Facebook is taking your data and selling it to other people. And that is pretty definitively not what's happening. It's that would be a breaking Facebook's business model. Facebook's business model is taking that data and providing a space in which advertisers can target information, not necessarily identifying you, until you want to be identified to that. If you want to click through and accept an offer and share your information, if you want to subscribe to to the New York Times. And in fact, traditional media organizations have been more and more aggressive with Facebook about saying, how do you facilitate that for us easily? And the company is now being more accommodating than it was previously. So it's not that this data flows willy-nilly. It's that there have always been a set of rules around how it flows. They're meant to reflect a sort of mainstream consumer expectation about that, while allowing for the growth of the platform. The company, as I've already indicated by having said I got into public dispute with the company, has not always done that right. And I think they would say that too. I think they are saying that right now. And what's come up in this particular situation recently, where the facts underlying this have been publicly reported a couple of years before, but the consequences have become clear. And the idea that we have to have a public debate about this, I think, is a healthy thing that's developed right now.
The model here is that Google's doing the same. It's building up profiles, information about each user, whatever characteristics it's trying to monitor. And an advertiser will say, I want to display certain information to people that fit this particular type of profile. So the information is not directly going out to the advertiser, as you're saying. It is that the advertiser is trusting that the company is then displaying accordingly to certain profiles. So I want to raise the issue that some issues that come up around the notion of building profiles of people. Professor Lessig has discussed some of these related to privacy issues for commercial domains. One of them is the inequality involved, for example, in different pricing models to people based on their profile, as opposed to somebody anonymously going to a store and everybody's getting the same price. In addition to the inequality issue, there's the notion that now we've all seen about manipulation, that the profile leads to a certain type of information flow, which might even then trigger more of there's a cycle of now acting more, and this increased polarization that we've seen. Can you comment on either of these?
I mean, from a polarization perspective, I think that that's a completely legitimate worry, and another part that has to be, I think, a key part of the public discourse around that. But I've had this discussion and dispute in some ways with my good friend Eli Pariser for years, who wrote The Filter Bubble. And it's important to point out that there were filter bubbles before in terms of what people selected to watch or not watch, and in terms of what people selected into who they decided to associate with or not associate with. The echo chambers existed before. What's changed, perhaps, is the quickness of the feedback loops and the technology and how it might sort of appeal to people in terms of reinforcing cognitive biases that they may already have. And again, this is an important thing to talk about. But the idea that technology has caused all of this in ab initio is just not accurate. We're talking about facts of human psychology that have operated for years and years, and that people had previously made their own choices as to did they trust NPR or Fox News, did they trust sort of their church group, their all of these different choices that people had made were pre-existing in some ways, and so filter bubbles already existed. The question is, are they amplified by technology? And I think the answer to that is probably yes. And then the question is what we do about it. Do you try to say, well, I'm going to stay off technology and avoid this possibility and somehow think that I'm living off the grid and I have a better life, and that's a choice that people can make. Or do you engage with how do I actually figure out how to reach across the aisle in terms of finding people who might have different beliefs than mine and feed them into. I'm actually going to head from here to a conference called Dialogue that I've been a part of for 12, 13 years now, which is the only place that I get to hang out with right-wing pundits and folks whose politics I disagree with, including Peter Thiel. But also with great aspects of the left and people from the left sort of participating in these things, and so figuring out how to break out of those filter bubbles is something that I think is sort of it's incumbent on people as individuals. And technology's amplification is a completely legitimate subject and something that should be deeply considered. But I don't think that we can say that technology has created these ideas in the first place.
No, I think that when we get amplification based on technology like surveillance of an individual, when you're trying to follow somebody is one thing, but when you're able to just sit someplace and track 1 million people's activities without having to get up off the chair, it becomes a completely different beast. What was the question I was just going to ask? I'm blanking on this. Let me ask you, so what about it had to do with fake news. Let me ask you, when we're using these profiles in order to get information flow to people, is it appropriate that we want to intervene in that? Is it that we should be tagging this information? What do you feel like is a fair way in order to match information that people are seeking to get out to somebody?
I mean, and that's what this is part of the problem that technology is trying to solve in a lot of these ways, and where the algorithms that go into newsfeed and that go into the Twitter feed and that go into the Instagram feed and all these different operative principles are trying to figure out how to match what's going to be most relevant to you at any given time, and to do it effectively in a way that brings some sort of pleasure to you. And that's where you can get into the addiction conversation about this. And I think that that's another thing that's a completely legitimate thing to talk about. But then the question is sort of what you do from there. If this is an addiction, how do you, if I'm getting something that makes me happy temporarily, that I'm connecting to people that I couldn't have connected to otherwise, how do I step away from that, and how do I have a practice of greater mindfulness and understanding? So the tagging of that information is something that you have to have some sort of control over what you present and what you put up, whether you choose to put it up or not. And then you have to figure out where your time is best spent in getting return information and the things that you want to see out of sharing your interests. And you talked about your LinkedIn perspective, where professionally you're trying to present the ideas that you're working on academically. I presume. I mean, so I will follow you on LinkedIn now. And then these are all, and this is where a lot of the debate that is existing in the public realm right now is, are these technology companies really media companies? And on some level, the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, they are the way that people are choosing to spend their time, and it's because the technology companies are delivering them more relevant information that they want to see. And some of that's because it's about their friends and people that they're close to, and some of it's about an easier way, and people still adapting to the idea of carrying a supercomputer in their pocket and a super surveillance device in their pocket, such that they can actually sort of get to a lot of things that they wouldn't be able to get to otherwise. I mean, I think that this is, I don't want to avoid talking about it in terms of the individual companies, because I think that there are choices that the companies make and that they should be held accountable for them, and that that's the right way to look at this. But also, we have to say that this is a major cultural moment and shift, and certainly that I've seen over my lifetime, where before it was really hard to get to information. I've seen the rise of the internet from when I got the chance to first get on the ARPANET, because my dad's bioinformatics company had a connection to the ARPANET years ago, and I started playing with computers, and that blew my mind at the time. But now it's just assumed that at any given time I can pull out my iPhone or Galaxy or whatever and grab whatever I want to see. If I want to see my Facebook feed, if I want to see my Twitter feed, that's just available to me at any given time, and that's a pretty massive change.
I think that there's a mindset issue that those of us that didn't grow up with some of this technology have seen it evolve through a process of design, and people that have grown up where that's always been there kind of take it as set as the speed of light. This is mentioned in, again, Lessig's code book, that this architectural notion just kind of discourages people from questioning whether or not that design is actually what we want it to be. A student just said to me yesterday that they hadn't realized that we could actually be dealing with user data in a different way, and that this was something that was changeable, which is foreign to me because I can just see how much this came out. Are we designing the use of data in a way that I think, are we looking at the right stakeholders? Are we balancing correctly? Are there changes that we maybe should really seriously think about making? I mean, this gets back to things like either fake news feed or the fact that we might have different pricing models for different people. Do you feel like the right factors are being considered and that we really have the stakeholders in the room?
So, I mean, I think that there has been an inappropriate, weighting of the speed and ease over, substance in a lot of ways. The problem is, how do you reflect that well in what inevitably are algorithmic choices? That you can't do it at the scale of a Facebook or a Twitter, with individuals making those decisions. You can empower people to have their own settings, and I think that there can and should be a public debate over whether Facebook, Twitter, Google, everyone, in the technology industry is providing adequate choices to people. And of course, there's always the choice of be on the platform or don't. But I think beyond that, there has to be a very public discussion of what are the choices on the platform, and are the companies really considering all the stakeholders, and that has been joined in a number of different ways over the years. Certainly, when I worked at the company, we had Beacon and Newsfeed, and but the introduction of Newsfeed, I always like to tell the story, and in fact, I gave a talk here 2 years ago where I gathered a lot of my thoughts on this. Newsfeed was an experience where everybody objected to it. They said it was the most offensive thing that they'd ever seen, and it was still a collegial insight at the time. And there were protests at Facebook headquarters over the introduction of Newsfeed. And it's hard to imagine the world without it today. And Twitter's design moved to a more algorithmic one over time because of Facebook's success. LinkedIn moved to a very feed-based system, and especially as you look at mobile devices and the way that they work, largely modeled on Facebook, and that change is always hard. But I think that I know for a fact from the time that I was at the company that a lot of these questions, problems, challenges are discussed and thought about internally, thought about and fought about. I should emphasize internally. And that the idea of public review is inherent in the operation of the companies, and I think you're seeing a really solid response from my perspective, from Mark and the team around realizing what actually happened in last year's elections and how it tied back to this improper data access and violation of Facebook's policies years before. And the question of how do you not allow that to happen again is front and center. And I don't know if folks have seen, but it was publicly announced Mark's going to testify before Congress next week. And I think that's a great thing. And I think that is accountability. And the discussion will be, and you've seen both Mark and Cheryl and a number of other folks say, look, regulatory changes are not, the company's not going to say no to that. Say that there shouldn't be any regulatory changes. The question is what those regulatory changes are, and how do you think about what government action in this area looks like. And the Honest Ads Act that's been introduced already seems to be a good step forward, and the principle that you would have accountability around, especially around getting rid of the fake profiles that were spreading a lot of the false news, is a significant step forward. And as the company said publicly now, the actions that they've taken in the French elections and the German elections were fairly effective in shutting down a lot of that stuff.
I want to know, just show of hands, are there questions? Because I would like to be able to move to questions if we have a bunch. Okay, so let me just finish up with one last question, then we'll move out to the audience. So you've mentioned a little bit about domestic laws potentially regulating privacy. I'm curious if you might say anything about the new, let's say, European law coming due, the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, that's coming due, I believe, at the end of May.
So GDPR is a follow-on to what has been expressed in European privacy principles for years. And so in a lot of ways, it's not going to be, I think, much different. There are stricter and more particular aspects of it. But the general principle around data being seen as, and personal data being seen as a human rights issue, as opposed to a much more commercial issue, and a sectoral approach in the U.S. where financial data and health data is more protected than other things. Although there were always the weird outliers like video rental records, which that came out of the
one congressperson, one person's, oh, that's what it was.
It was the Robert Bork Supreme Court nomination case where they asked for his video rental records. and you got a law against that. So kind of interesting sets of approaches there was, Europe has always taken a much more comprehensive approach to it. The thing that everybody needs to be careful about, I think, Europeans and Americans and everybody around the globe, is you want to allow people to still give permission for for data usage that actually allows them to thrive and make their own choices. And the only problem, the only objection that I've ever raised in European discussions, and it was a significant part of my job in the early years to spend time with European regulators and explain that we were building technology around letting people make their own choices at Facebook, and that we believe that it reflects the principles that are reflected in the prior directive and in a lot of the individual country implementations. And we want to have an ongoing dialogue about what that means. The problem from a company perspective, and obviously I don't represent the company anymore, but was that everybody had their own kind of pet peeve about what they needed to happen. Some people wanted to say, well, you can't tag photos anymore. And it's like, well, under U.S. law, it's the person who takes the photo has the copyright, they upload it, they represent that they've got the rights to do that. They implicitly have the right to tag who's in it too, and by introducing tag notifications, we actually let people know if they're tagged in the photograph, and they can take it down. And that was a system that we set up, and we actually had a fight with that with Canada, with the Canadian Privacy Commissioner, over that system. Where various European, especially the Lander Commissioner in Germany, individual state commissioners in Germany would say, well, the like button is illegal here. You can't have a like button. It's like, well, where do you go from there? It's hard to have some of these conversations. It's going to be hard to have some of these conversations under GDPR. But I think that it's a good expression of a principle that these are supposed to be active choices made. And the best thing to do is to allow people to make their own choices by building technology around it. But then there are inevitably going to be kind of disputes at the margins where there's going to be a disagreement, and companies have to be ready for that. They have to make a choice and ship a product.
If I had to do it in one sentence, I would say that U.S. tends towards having to opt out, and Europe tends towards having to opt in. And when you start talking about tagging, and I don't know how this works, I wonder, is Facebook in principle could build a profile about me without my ever being a user there?
Yeah, that's right.
Is that ethical?
So I think that it's, in the same way that there are all sorts of people who build profiles about you without your consent today. It's
lots of fans.
It's a real fact about the world that's developed. Whether it's Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, whether it's data providers in the political space that will determine whether you're registered to vote, whether you actually voted in an election, all of which is public record. All of these different things, the idea that Facebook or Google or Twitter are the first people to do this in any way is just not a fact. And so it always has to be put in some sort of context. And the idea that you would have 5 friends who would be there to greet you when you join Facebook is, to some people, a very attractive thing.
Well, you're already
I've already offered.
But I mean, if I look at the right to delete,
it depends on what it's you. And actually, this is one of the things that we did early on, and that we did explain to the Europeans early on. There is a right to delete on Facebook.
So I would have the right to delete the account about me that I never created.
That's right.
Okay.
And you don't have that right with Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, by the way.
That's right. No, it's the right to correct in principle. Yeah. Okay.
Right.
I want to open it up. Thank you so much. I want to open it up to questions. And so, if you guys want to help, I just go around. I don't know how to. Please, let's start there.
Hi, I'm Heather Pickerel. I'm a current JD student here. Facebook had a pretty controversial attempted rollout to internet access in India recently, which raised a lot of issues with net neutrality and the access to internet in developing countries. I was wondering if you could speak to this a little bit about Facebook going forward, whether or not they've changed their policies going forward when it comes to net neutrality and internet provision.
So This was well after I left, first of all, so I don't have any sort of insight as to, and I don't have any insight as to where they are right now in terms of so generally speaking, I don't think that zero rating plans are a violation of net neutrality. I've spent a fair amount of time on it, and I understand the argument for why it might be seen that way. And but I think that the zero rating programs are providing access where where it didn't necessarily exist before. And I also know that there was a dispute about whether Facebook's Free Basics in India was actually a zero rating program or not, or whether it went actually much further in terms of its preference. But particularly where you're talking about emerging markets, I do think that it's important for more access rather than less. And I do think that there should be watchdog discussions about whether or not there are real violations of net neutrality that then end up sort of completely improperly advantaging only one player. But I do think that if a company wants to invest in that provision, that they should, generally speaking, be allowed to. Look, it got caught up, and I know they ended up pulling it back, in a substantial way. But I don't know what a relaunch should look like. So I'm not as up on it as I would be if I were.
Sure, please.
Thank you so much. I'm also a JD student here, and I wanted to ask you about this idea of user control over data, and specifically the ability or lack of ability to authorize access to a third party. And so I was curious about how you now think about something like the Power Ventures case and that sort of intermediary in the ecosystem.
Well, I mean, looking back to the Power case and to a number of others in that space, and a number of other, there were a number of attempts to use platform essentially to set up an additional layer above Facebook, and in a way that we thought at the time, and we think rightfully so, that didn't comport with user expectations. And I think that the access points, and that actually was, those type of attempts were quite informative in terms of the way that platform might be misused. And help set a number of the rules around that. And that, I think, generally speaking, was meant to be very protective of reasonable user expectations in that instance. Obviously the company hasn't gotten this right over time, and they would say this, and I would say this, and the operation of those principles, and especially on the enforcement side. That's, I think, one of the key learnings from the Cambridge Analytica case in recent days. But I don't think that one of the things that the company has done particularly well lately is that they've been a lot more forthcoming about saying these are actually really hard questions on a number of different levels. Is that you want to have people be able to choose to share data in a reasonable way, in a reasonably easy way, so that they can achieve the goals that they're trying to achieve in their life. You're trying to be a platform that facilitates that. While at the same time you're trying to minimize the possibility of misuse and exploitation and improper sort of operation in ways that would surprise people. And getting that balance right is extraordinarily difficult. Particularly when you're operating in a world where it's new to have everybody interconnected in the way that they are. And so I think that each of these, as these things kind of build to crisis points and public discussion, that there's a lot of learning that's going on, on all sides, and that too often it gets reduced to the kind of sloganeering that you see in politics over Facebook is doing this, or Google is doing this, or Twitter is doing this, and it's usually Facebook these days, and it probably will be for a while, realistically. But I think that the engagement that you're seeing on these topics from the company now is encouraging. It's certainly encouraging to me, and I hope it's encouraging to a lot of people.
Any question for you, and then you?
Hi, thank you.
you.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of who has responsibility when it comes to discriminatory targeted ads. Two things that come to mind are, I think ProPublica found that advertisers could target people who express like anti-Semitic
posts and then the research about discriminatory housing ads. I'd love to hear you.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of that came from having automated tools that were built on express preferences that were sitting on the platform, and not the type of culling that should have been happening in a lot of ways, in terms of the way that the standards of the content standards of the company were previously expressed. And so you had these automated systems allowing for ad targeting against things that were offensive content that may not have been caught previously, whether because it hadn't been reported or because the machine learning that they're trying to apply in a lot of these cases hadn't caught profiles that were that were likely violative of the terms of service. And I think that this is another case where the journalism that was done there actually proved out the fact that the systems weren't working the way that the company represented that they were, and the company endeavored to change those systems. And so I think that the perfection can't be the standard at the end of the day, and that as long as there's a responsiveness that exists there. And I think a lot of people had been complaining for quite some time that Facebook hadn't been as responsive on a lot of these things, and I think that there's a lot of attention being paid to all of these things right now internal.
Question back.
Hi, my name is Nico Rassa of the 3LP. Thank you so much for being here and for your comments and a lot of good questions. I'm curious about your thoughts on how digital technologies are affecting our cognitive abilities writ large. And I see this as something that Facebook sort of embodies as one of the primary players in the digital attention economy. A lot of anecdotal stories and research has suggested that a lot of consumption and internet use has actually diminished individual capacity to think deeply. It's made us more emotional, more responsive and reactive. And I see a lot of trends in society that are reflective of that. And I'm just wondering what you think and how you see the responsibility of corporate players in this.
I think that the corporate players have to take this seriously as they provide the products. I think that a lot of kind of preliminary data on this certainly merits a further look. I don't think that you can sort of instantaneously kind of jump to the conclusion that this like the Benioff statement that this should be regulated like tobacco and I don't even know what that type of regulation would look like. The knowledge that you're making changes in your habits based on the availability of information is a significant part of the question that everybody should be asking themselves, and that as a general mental health factor as a society we should be talking to everybody about, that I talk to my kids about. I mean, we limit we limit screen time. We limit, and none of them are on any networks and anything else. But we limit their Minecraft time and their movie time too. Sometimes it's time to go play outside. You have to have this balanced perspective to all of these things, and the fact that we are holding supercomputers in our hand that gives us access to as much as we do is something that you need to make sure that you don't kind of fall too far down into a rabbit hole on. The choice of that versus sitting mindlessly in front of the TV or things like that. These are all things that need to be studied very carefully and very meaningfully and talked about as what sort of lives do we want to lead. The problem comes when you start to talk about what's the prescription for how you deal with it. When you start to talk about regulations, like, well, what's the regulation look like? When you start to talk about psychological studies, and there was something that showed up in the I forget if it ever actually got into the DSM, the standard sort of Bible of psychiatric illnesses, but it was talk about internet addiction being an added diagnosis in the DSM at some point. And I think that kind of went away over time, and the cycling of a lot of the psychological statements about what's going on, it sounds a lot like internet addiction, actually, to me. And so we have to be careful about that too. I don't mean to, and I don't want to, and I don't think we all should dismiss the possibility that this is a radical change for people and the way that they interrelate. But I also don't think that we should say, hey, there's these new things, whether it's smartphones, whether it's Facebook, whether it's social media in general, YouTube, whatever, that they're necessarily sort of making all of these long-term changes. I should say that from a business perspective, I'm a believer that all of this access makes a big difference in terms of the choices that people make, and have directed my investment dollars and time in that way. But have done a number of things that are very traditional, in sports, in movies, and in all of these different offerings that are designed to have an ease of access for consumers. For my perspective and my desire being that they will have, every individual consumer will have more time to spend time with their friends and family in their life. And I don't want Movie Pass users going to 8 movies a day, and it's only one a day. But I don't want to go to 8 movies in a week necessarily. I don't think that's a good thing. I don't want Fandor streamers binge watching for 96 hours on a weekend.
Unless it's Battlestar Galactica.
Right, exactly. But I do think that offering that ease of access, and look, and as much as I love our Kings fans, I don't want them in the arena all the time, and I don't want them streaming Kings content 24 hours a day either. I think that ease is sort of the coin of the new realm in a lot of ways. But we also need to say, look, everyone needs to have a good perspective on their lives and how they connect with their families and their friends, and what is a good community experience for them.
I might add, I think part of it is the difference in mood after watching versus interacting. Minecraft leaves kids in a different state than watching a bunch of YouTube videos. And that's something, to me, rather than regulation, we could gamify. And I think that it's really easy for systems to be building in rewards for people who then are somehow interacting with the system because we know it leaves them in a more engaged or happy state. I'm not trying to be Pollyanna about it. It's looking at what we think is beneficial for people in the long term, for society and for them in their lives, and trying to incentivize that type of behavior, which I think does not preclude some sort of internet access. It's just the way that we're getting them to do it. So,
although some people would say that gamification is a very dopamine hit, that's the addictive property of.
But if you're getting the dopamine hit because you went out and exercised, fine.
Right.
Yeah.
We have
Okay.
time, so we have a
Couple more.
If this
Okay.
question, and then we'll take one back. Just by way of, I guess, corporate housekeeping, you're willing to stick around a little bit?
Yeah. So the
if you
recording
have
ends
to
up.
leave, we understand, we appreciate it, but first let's give a round of applause for us. Well, we're going to stay here afterwards, so let's continue with the question here, there, and to the back.
I just wanted to actually kind of have a follow-up question to that last point. I've noticed in the past couple of years, just within my own circle of friends, after some of them started working at Facebook, more and more of us started using Facebook less.
So what did you think of the people who started working at Facebook?
No, they started telling us a little bit more about how much they knew about it. So we're like, oh, that's weird. But to add to that point, my question was, what you're talking about, and I think what you've been saying, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the idea of like personal choice, right? And it's really that we have access to these great things, whether it's the internet or Facebook, and it's a lot about personal choice and what we used to do with it, whether that's reaching across the aisle politically or kids using it. But at the same time, isn't that directly opposed to Facebook's goals of wanting me on the platform for as long as possible? So if I limit my own screen time, right? Like I I'm trying to find a balance here where what Filippo kind of asked is that where does corporate responsibility, like I don't really see a day where Facebook's going to tell me, hey, you've been here for 30 minutes, go read a book. And that they shouldn't be, because that would make no sense to their shareholders and to them. So where is that kind of balance where as individuals we have to be very careful and make choices, and then as a company, Facebook should kind of be helping us?
And I mean, I think I can see I can see a future where the company actually does build a timer that tells you when your time is up. I mean, I think that the internal discussion would be, well, why should we devote engineering resources to that? People are looking at it on their phone; they can just set it on iOS. And so I think that Tim Cook should build you that timer. And then maybe that's easy. But I think that it's when you've seen Mark actually discuss on the earnings call that they were sort of proud about a little bit less time spent on Facebook. This time around, as they altered some of the algorithm and talking very openly about community building, and that a lot of the videos that they're trying to share in the newsfeed and allow in the newsfeed more prominently are about connection, and and I think that that's a work in progress for the company at this point.
So we have one here, and then
I would add, you can imagine that a company is looking for a long-term sustainability, and if they're afraid that the users are going to get basic burnout from using it, then it's in their interest in the long term. Maybe it's wanting to have a really good long-term user experience, which may necessitate kind of reminding people to get up and walk around once in a while, but then come back, right? That's it. Yeah.
Yes, I'm just a stranger walking off the street, but actually this is Harvard Law School. So I have a law question for Chris. So in the recent omnibus, something called SESTA passed, which was really the first change to Section 230, in the last 20 years or so. Could you talk a little bit about 230? I mean, and I know you've worked on the other aspect of sex trafficking and other pieces of safety. Can you talk a little bit about what you think that change means for internet companies as they try to maneuver now that 230 has been changed for the first time?
And I think it's a great question. And for context, this is Adam Connor, who's a fellow at the Institute of Politics, was Facebook's first Washington employee. He's a good friend, and wandered by to join us here today. And so the changes that were made, there were a bunch of proposals for the abrogation of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act over time. Quite frankly, to get into a little bit of the sausage making of it, driven by media companies who wanted more, accountability for internet companies and just slow them down because they're worried about their growth. And what we finally got to, and they used a serious issue that has to be dealt with by online platforms, and what, to my mind, certainly a moral abuse of 230. By Backpage and Craigslist and a number of other players, where they basically said, we're not going to shut down sex trafficking acts. After I lost the AG race in 2010, I helped sponsor Prop 35 in California, which upgraded California's anti-human trafficking laws. Because the problem was just so bad. And people
can we just say 230? This has to do with whether or not the company hosting the user
right.
data
So
is responsible for
liability.
the nature of that content.
That's exactly right.
Okay.
So the platform liability.
And by default, they're not.
And by default, they're not under Section 230.
Okay.
So the SESTA, the stop, what is it? It's like
two different things.
Stop Online Sex Trafficking Act, or they called it a number of different things. It basically says that if you know that your platform is being used for sex trafficking, that you may be liable. And there were a whole bunch of fights around the language, and they mostly got to what I think will be an acceptable place as this gets litigated out, because I do think it is a scourge, and I do think it is a moral abuse of 230. For especially Backpage to have repeatedly said we're not going to, we are basically going to be a forum for online prostitution ads, and we don't care. That's just what we do. I think that this will deal with that problem without turning into a 230 was always a mistake, and because I don't think it was. One of the sets of conversations that we had regularly when I was at Facebook was, there there's a difference between holding a platform legally liable for bad things that go on it, and that platform having the ability and right to guide and minimize those bad things that may happen. The constant refrain that I had with, especially with a variety of attorneys general, and especially Andrew Cuomo, in the early days when Facebook and MySpace were both under unbelievable pressure from the AGs around exploitation of teenage, especially girls, but some boys too, and that these were unsafe platforms for teenagers, and we said, well, look, there are bad things that go on in the real world. They are inevitably going to be somewhat facilitated by connection networks. We have taken a variety of steps at Facebook, from reeling culture, operations, everything else, to minimize the possibility that something would go wrong in that way. But I guarantee you something will go wrong. There will be an exploitation of minor on our platform, and we're not happy about that. It doesn't mean we should be held legally
So
liable.
I think part of this is the ability to take down content without putting yourself at risk of saying I'm responsible for all of my content.
Right, that's right.
And so it is one thing. So it's this selective ability to try to, and also whether the platform is used mainly for illicit purposes, which we have seen in IP, like Napster was mainly, versus whether like the the copying of movies with the VCRs was not for the sole purpose of evading copyright. So there's case law that kind of relates to this. I think companies are looking for the ability to take down something that they think is really not okay without then being held responsible for everything else that's on there.
So we have a question here, and then here, and then.
The recording stopped, so
Okay.
thanks
So,
again.
follow on to regulatory questions. The history of regulatory frameworks for information communication technology in Europe is more holistic versus here in the U.S., where I would say it's much more piecemeal. Robert Bork being one primary
It's very
example.
siloed,
Go
yeah.
back to the telegraph and beyond, and I think the history is proven. So given that ICT is effectively borderless, what's the push-pull between, let's say, the European model and what may ultimately develop here in the U.S.? Is there the prospect of maybe there being a global standard that ultimately emerges?
Well, and historically, the internet, and we need to get Zitrain in here to run through a whole bunch of this stuff. But historically, there has been this, there's been a resistance to any sort of move in global directions to try to standardize, because the global bodies that exist, quite frankly, aren't particularly trusted. That there's worry that it would end up sort of breaking the way that things work right now, and the internet governance structure is still pretty funky from a traditional governance perspective and the way that it's thought about. When you talk about operating through different media and different access points, we've obviously had the fight here over cable and net neutrality questions for broadband access and things like that. So I certainly don't think there's going to be a move to a global standard anytime soon because of distrust of the available global institutions. I think that there are going to be a bunch of different fights, by different players who have different interests on the individual country level regulatory issues. And I think that as more traditional media companies morph into expecting most of their people to be receiving content on smartphones, and the wireless carriers too playing in this, and and obviously we've got AT&T Time Warner here. We'll have a variety of other attempted consolidations, especially if that goes through around the globe. I think that there's going to be a lot of kind of hand-to-hand combat in individual countries on this. More
If
than
I
anything
could,
else.
then what does that do when you think about differing standards between Europe and the U.S.? Again, the idea this is borderless, the operating domain, what does that
A lot
do
of it's going to be
for
about
ICT?
where the servers are located at the end of the day. Like that's That's what if you tell the regulators that it's borderless, they'll say, well, don't come to my country then.
But I mean, the new European rules, I think, dictate it's based on where the user is situated. Right? They don't care where your server.
That's right, and this was there've always been a variety of discussions between American technology companies and the European providers on this, because the way that before GDPR is getting to some more clarity on this, but the old sort of data controller, data processor question that was a part of a lot of European privacy law, companies were using that in a variety of ways, and they were using binding corporate rules and all these different things to allow for permission data transfer. And of course, the safe harbor, the Commerce Department here negotiated after fears that the European standard would be applied too aggressively to disadvantage American technology companies was one of the things that got worked out.
Okay, last two questions. One here and one here.
He had.
Here.
So you're headed towards the Internet of Things, and in context of big data and trying to foresee the future of what's going to happen during the next 10 to 15 years in terms of an object-oriented Internet, where does this lie in a regulatory context in terms of policy making?
I mean, I think that the way, there's going to be a lot of work on how, you've seen some security risks with IoT, essentially hardware devices with software that can be compromised and turned into botnets already kind of spring up in a number of different places. I think that there's going to be a lot of focus on how you permission access to networks from IoT devices that have some limited use. And particularly as you look at homes and everything in your home being connected in some meaningful way, I see it springing up first and foremost in the security space, but then over time, how I guess there's no particular reason that I shouldn't be able to stream my Pandora video to my refrigerator. But the question is, will people insist on that? Will consumers insist on that? And what will the usage patterns? How will they persist? I actually do now have a refrigerator that is internet connected finally. Which I was promised 20 years ago. That was supposed to be my future 20 years ago.
But I think a larger question for me is something like the listing devices that are constantly connected to the cloud.
Okay.
And we've already seen that this is being used in criminal prosecution as having recorded something that went on. And I was having a conversation last night where somebody didn't realize that the only way that works is that you're constantly
Siri,
sending
how
your...
do I hide a murder weapon?
But it's it's constantly listening and uploading what it's hearing up to the cloud so that it can decide whether or not to answer you. I don't want that in my house. And as more and more devices are, I want the ability to be able to say, okay, device, connect to the cloud now. Okay, now I'm done. Stop sending. And I don't see that level of privacy enabled yet, and I would really like to have that before I feel comfortable putting something in my home.
And I think that's a completely
reasonable request.
Fair commentary, a completely reasonable request.
Last question
Please.
over here.
You talked about supporting an exception to Section 230. As somebody who was protected by Section 230 and managed to get a lawsuit dismissed against me because of 230, I'm really wary about punching holes in it. If you punch one hole in it, are you going to punch more?
Let me be clear. Me too. And the way that they were proposing to punch holes in it was particularly offensive for quite some time, and then it got negotiated to a much better state.
Meaning that if you punch a hole in it, that somebody's then increasingly responsible for the user content on their site.
Well, also, if there's a precedent that somebody wants to punch a different hole in it,
that they can just sort of pursue it.
you don't really have Section 230 anymore.
And where you have conflicts, and we talked about the discriminatory ads question earlier, there's a Ninth Circuit case on roommates.com about the fair housing in listings, and where there was an attempted abrogation that I think was corrected on appeal, or on like a third appeal, where it was said, well, this fair housing law is in conflict with 230, the fair housing law wins. And it was paid attention to very carefully for a long time, but since I'm not sort of in the trenches day to day, I forget exactly how it worked out.
So Chris and Ron, thank you. Before we wrap up, and Chris will stay around for can I ask one final question? So in the practice this month, we focus on character and fitness in the legal profession as a prerequisite to being admitted to the bar. Florida in 2009, the Board of Bar Examiners began a discussion about the use of, or looking at and accessing social media as evidentiary of a person's, or representing a person's character, whether that should be reviewed in evaluating one's character and fitness to practice law. Given what you know about Facebook, and given what we all know, what people post on it, should it ever be, and what would you say, what is your opinion about its use, and what would you advise law students if that does become a practice? And keep in mind, it's a state-by-state approach. The ABA has frowned upon it, but it's quite possible that may change.
So I think it depends on the access question. If someone has chosen to make their stream, of photos from Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, completely public, I actually think it's a completely legitimate source of information to look at. I think that engaging in further, and one of the things that we resisted in the early days of Facebook was government employers demanding the Facebook passwords of government employees, and we went to AFSCME and said, you may want to get involved in this. And it's an abuse of power in that type of context. But where if it's do you do a quick social media search to see if somebody matching this description, matching this name and date of birth, and and if you're the bar examiners, you have social. I don't see anything inherently wrong with that. I think that I've always tried to warn people, that look, if you truly don't want something to be found, do not create a record of it. Like that's the creation of a record is of something that you don't want to be known is a risk. And I think that definitely applies to social media. I don't think that people should have to worry that they're somehow being stalked by their employers or by the bar or anything like that. And if they've taken reasonable steps to keep it as a piece of private information, that they should be entitled to.
Well, thank you again.